Hi everybody. So today, or for this week, we are covering the concepts of race and racism. We are looking at these things from an anthropological perspective, meaning we are interested in race and racism as a cultural concept, as a set of symbols or a symbolic system that shapes social organization. So we're not looking at individuals, we're looking at social systems. A lot of what I'm going to be lecturing about comes from the optional reading, Lee Baker's History of a Racialized Worldview, which talks about the history of how this belief system took shape historically, primarily in the 19th century, but starting into the 18th century to some extent, in which race became a concept that people organized their entire societies around in a way that had never been done before. So here's the overview for what we're doing in this PowerPoint. I'm going to introduce two concepts: structural violence, which comes out of medical anthropology, and race and racism. I'm going to put off intersectionality until next week, so don't worry about that for now. The key argument I'm going to be making is that race is a social construct. Race is not a biological reality. There is no biological basis to race whatsoever. Now, many of you might find that confusing because you look around and you say, wait, but white people are more likely, when two white people get married, the kid is often white. That seems to be the pattern. Isn't that a biological reality? So I'm going to explain that later in the slide. I'll explain exactly what I mean by this statement, that race has no biological reality whatsoever. However, racism is a social reality. It is a social structure. It is a social construction or a symbolic system that organizes society in real ways. That social reality, it is real, right? That is something that shapes our actual human experience. So the trick here, right, is race is a social fiction, but racism is very much real. Now, the concept of race is a social construct that emerges in the 18th and 19th centuries. It did not exist prior to that point. This is a new set of ideas. This is a new worldview. Lastly, I want to define racism for you because I have a definition for racism, and it's important that we understand that definition. Racism is prejudice plus structural power or structural inequalities. You need both things. You need the prejudice and you need the systematic inequalities. The reason for this is because we are interested in racism as a social system. This is bigger than any individuals. In the United States, we often think about racism, we're often taught to think about racism as a moral failing, as an individual problem. If you are racist, that makes you bad. That is a worldview, that is a perspective that, for me as an anthropologist, I would argue is actually detrimental to our ability to understand violence, to understand social organization, and to understand race and racism. Because it gets us stuck thinking about our individual moral value, and it gets us stuck in a place that's often defensive. And as such, we're more focused on our individually, am I a good person, am I a bad person, instead of understanding a social system that causes harm. So for me, when I talk about racism, I am never going to be talking about you as an individual and whether you're a good person or a bad person. I'm going to be talking about a cultural system, meaning it's a worldview, it's a system of our symbols and what we think is normal and natural. that is ingrained, right? It's the air we breathe. It's like asking a fish to say, like, what is water, and the fish doesn't know, right? It's the same kind of thing as that. So it's a worldview, it's a symbolic system, and it's a social structure. It's a principle upon which we have organized our society in the United States and in many other countries. Now, one implication of this definition, racism is prejudice plus structural power, is that there is no such thing as racism against white people. There is no such thing as reverse racism. You can be prejudiced against white people. That is absolutely possible. However, racism is prejudice plus structural power, plus systematic social inequalities. And there are simply not social structures and systematic inequalities on a large scale, on the scale of the United States as a whole, that disadvantage white people. It just is not. White people are not disadvantaged by systems of structural power. If you want to get into the nuances, we can do that at a later point in office hours. But in the context of this lecture, for the sake of time, I need to be able to go deeper, which means not getting caught up in that particular part. But the piece to know here is we're talking about a system. We're talking about the larger system of which racial categories are considered where they are placed in a larger social-wide hierarchy. And this is important because as social scientists, we need language that helps us understand social systems. Not just individual actions, but social systems. So racism is a term that helps us get at social systems. It only goes in one direction. Again, if you're feeling like, oh, that's not fair because you can be racist against white people, no, you cannot be racist against white people. You can be prejudiced against white people. We have a word for the thing that you are thinking of, and it is prejudice. But we need another word to talk about larger social systems, and that word is racism. Okay, so I want to pick up where we left off last week with medical anthropology and introduce several types of violence. When in the United States, we have a tendency when we think about violence to think exclusively about interpersonal violence. By interpersonal violence, I mean violence that is direct between two individuals or between a group, specific tangible individuals, right? Somebody causes another person harm in a direct way, whether through physical violence, through other forms of harm, or microaggressions, or something like that, right? There's a direct, like saying something bigoted directly, right? That is interpersonal violence. That is direct violence. However, this is only one type of violence. There are many types of violence. And as social scientists, we want to understand violence on a social level, not only an interpersonal level. And this is really important because that interpersonal violence relies on these deeper systems of symbolic and structural violence. Now, when we talk about structural and symbolic violence, we're talking about forms of violence that don't necessarily happen on an individual level. It's not one person being violent to another person. Sometimes there aren't any bad apples. There aren't any people who are acting in a bad way. And yet, the violence still happens. It's real. So we saw that really clearly with Paige West's dispossession and the environment, right? We saw a world in which everyone was well-intentioned for the most part. Surfers wanted to, protect and enjoy the environment, and were concerned about Papua New Guinean people assimilating in a patronizing way, but still it was well-intentioned, whether or not it was patronizing and bad, like whatever. Um, International development agencies are trying to solve global poverty. Conservationists are trying to save an endangered species. Everyone is acting with good intentions. And yet, violence continues to happen. So everyone's acting with good intentions, but their intentions are being directed through a belief system, through a cultural worldview of social evolutionism, of these kinds of implicit hierarchical understandings that then reproduce violence even when nobody is trying, even when nobody wants to. It's completely unintentional. But just because that violence is unintentional does not make it less real. It does not make it less harmful. So we need language for thinking about these other forms of violence that are sort of underneath and support that surface level of interpersonal violence. One of these is symbolic violence. I can explain this most easily by giving you a historical example, because when we go back in the past, when we look at historical examples, it's going to be different enough from our belief systems today that it'll be a little easier to see. And then we can kind of move forward once we have that basic understanding to seeing how does this work today. So if you look historically, there's a really important scholar named Frantz Fanon, who has been really influential in the ways we think about race and racism. He is a psychoanalyst, and he actually fought in the Algerian Revolution, which was a really bloody war for liberation from France as a colonizing power. And in his scholarship, one of the things he articulates is this idea that there's an entire worldview to these colonial systems. There's an entire set of value hierarchies that distinguish, that divide white people, or Europeans, and black people, or Africans, into these hierarchical categories of colonizer and colonized. And he's interested in the psychological impacts of this belief system. And so basically what he unpacks here, right, is that colonialism introduces this hierarchical model in which whiteness is considered good, is considered civilized, is considered better, is considered morally good, is associated with lawfulness and order, right? This is the exact same value hierarchy that we unpacked when we talked about social evolutionism, when we talked about dispossession and the environment and the construction of the other, right? All of these ideas come from this scholar, Frantz Fanon. On the other hand, blackness is constructed as being negative, as being a lack of moral worth, as being less civilized or primitive or savage, depending on the language being used at the time. Right? So you have an explicit racist hierarchy that justifies a colonial world order. Now, what Frantz Fanon is particularly interested in is the moments where African people actually start believing this worldview. They themselves internalize this exact worldview and start thinking whiteness is associated with better, is associated with civilization, is associated with all of these positive things, and that is what they should be striving for, right? This is what today we call internalized oppression. When you internalize a oppressive hierarchy so that you start believing it yourself. Even if you are a member of an oppressed group, you may still internalize that belief system. So for Frantz Fanon, one of the things he was really interested in is how do you challenge, how do you disrupt, how do you overthrow this belief system, this internalized form of oppression, in order to imagine yourself in different terms, to imagine yourself. And again, he's interested in post-colonial movements in Africa, right? How do Africans begin to imagine themselves in a way that is not based on these colonial ideologies that are handed to them? Now, the short answer is his answer to that was actually through revolution. And this was, he's writing in the 50s or so, right? This is the height of the post-colonial movements where many countries were engaging in revolutionary overthrow of colonial powers. So he is certainly, he's writing in that historical context. So this idea of symbolic violence, right, the ways in which hierarchies are encoded in our belief systems or our worldviews, that actually provides the symbolic basis within which interpersonal violence happens, right? Interpersonal violence, direct violence happens on the basis of people's belief systems, right? It's what shapes those patterned forms of behavior. But it can also include violence that itself is intended to send a message. Now, I'm going to get a little bit... So here, trigger warning here is what I want to say. Trigger warning, I'm going to talk about sexual assault. So, historically, if you look at the decolonization of India and Pakistan, one of the techniques that European powers did when they dismantled these colonial administrations and provided sovereignty or the ability to self-govern to the places that had been colonized, one of the things they did is they divided these countries up in a way to maximize interethnic conflict between them in order to continually destabilize these countries. This is, we can talk about this more if you want to learn more about this, but it's extremely well documented that this is what, this is not, it's not subtle, right? This is an explicit effort to create destabilization by making sure that you draw borders between countries in such a way as to maximize internal ethnic conflict. So, India and Pakistan, right, you have this conflict between, in this example, Muslim and Hindu communities, right? And so you have Muslims in India and you have Hindus in Pakistan, right? But you create this system of violence. And historically, in this moment, India and Pakistan start really what does it mean to be Pakistani? What does it mean to be Indian, right? Suddenly you now are your own nation, right? The colonial power is being removed, at least in the sense of direct military control is being removed. And now you are a citizen of this thing called India. What does that mean? So part of how that gets established, it gets constructed, is through conflict between these countries, right? To be Indian means you're not Pakistani. To be Pakistani means you're not Indian. It's that kind of symbolic opposition. And one of the things that emerges in this context is a system in which both Hindu and Muslim nationalists or Pakistani nationalists are basically identifying themselves on the basis of religion and then kidnapping women from the other country and the other religious group. And it's not really totally clear what happens after the women are kidnapped because there was a lot of even after a diplomatic decision was reached and these women were able to return home, the survivors were able to return home, they don't really want to talk about it. So it's not really known what exactly happened in that kidnapping situation, but it was extremely traumatic, and you can guess. So, in this example, women, Indian women, Pakistani women, are being socially constructed or symbolically constructed as a resource that can be seized and possessed to as a kind of symbol for territory, as a symbol for conflict or war against this other country, as a way of conquering this other country, or showing, yeah. So that's symbolic violence, right? It's violence that is organized through a symbolic system in order to send a message about what it means to be Pakistani, what it means to be Indian, and about controlling national resources. And women are symbolically constructed in this concept, not as human beings, but as resources. There's lots and lots of examples of this. Another one in the United States is what's called corrective rape. This is when queer people are targeted for rape in this kind of logic of creating a punishment for being queer, right? This is especially something you hear about a lot with trans people and lesbian or bisexual women. This is a symbolic form of violence. The third form of violence is structural violence. I'm going to talk more about that in the last slide, but structural violence really gets at this question of what kinds of, how do we understand violence where there are no bad actors, where everyone is acting with the best intentions and violence is still happening. Okie dokie, so this is a really lovely diagram. Before I keep going on that example, what we see here is direct violence. We see an iceberg, right? And the tip of that iceberg is direct violence, or what I've been calling interpersonal violence. But underneath, right, underneath that water line, we see these deeper forms of model. Cultural violence, or what I was calling symbolic violence, which includes our mental models, our world views, and structural violence, our patterns and institutions, our structures. So structural violence is a concept that comes out of medical anthropology, and it was a way of talking about many of the things we were talking about last class, right? When I gave you examples, for example, of different health outcomes on the basis of race, on the basis of gender or sexuality, on the basis of class, right? That is a social structure. That is violence that is happening on a social structure. It is literally causing people to die. But there's not like one thing you can point to. There's not one moment where people are actively killed that you can point to. It's a larger, complicated set of social structures that has the effect of violence. It has the effect of people dying or people having negative health outcomes. So one example I often give for structural violence is the education system. Because it's another one of these systems where we organize our institutions in a way that have violent effects, but no single person in that system has bad intentions. No one is acting in an immoral way. So the way we organize public schools here in the United States is that funding for schools is tied to property taxes, meaning the taxes that people pay on their homes. The thing is, if you live in a nicer neighborhood, if you have a nicer home, the value of that property will be higher, and you will pay more taxes on it. What this means is that if you live in a nicer neighborhood, and you go to school in a nicer neighborhood, you're going to have a lot more funding in those schools than people who go to school in more low-income neighborhoods. So what we're seeing here is that on the basis of wealth, right, if you have more wealth, you're going to go to a better funded school. You're going to go to a school that has more resources, and you're going to get, chances are, overall, statistically speaking, this is not about individuals, but statistically speaking, you're going to get a better education. That better education is going to position you to do things like go to a better college. That's going to position you to get a better job and make more money over the course of your life, which means you're going to end up buying a house in a nicer neighborhood, which means if you have kids, you're going to send them to a better school that's better funded. So it's a cycle, right? It's a cycle that reproduces itself. Now, one thing that I think about a lot is something that a scholar, a really prominent scholar in Black Studies, Bell Hooks, said in a presentation she was giving, right? She was talking about exactly this example. And she was talking about the problems of affirmative action. And particularly, the idea is, right, like, okay, so if we're a college, right, and we're making decisions who we bring into, or a job, or whatever it is, right, we're making decisions about who we accept, right? Affirmative action would have us say, okay, if there are two equally qualified candidates, and one is white and one is a person of color, in order to recognize the historical exclusion of people of color from these systems, we should probably, like, prioritize bringing in certain numbers of people of color and, and weigh that. Now, the problem here, right, is if you have two equally people who have kind of equal merit, they didn't have an equal starting place to get to that point, right, necessarily. I'll do poverty first because it's a little more simple, and then I'll explain the race and how race intersects into this, right? So, like, for example, if you're low income, right, that means you went to a worse school, which means you have had less advantages, which means it's going to be much harder or impossible to be able to present an application that is comparable to someone who went to a better resourced, for example, prep school. And even if you as an individual are able to do that, even if you are able to, like, go to that level, statistically speaking, most students in that system will not be able to do that because most students will be disadvantaged. I mean, all students will be disadvantaged, and that is going to play out on the level of statistics, not individual outcomes. So yes, an individual person from a poor school, a poor neighborhood, will absolutely end up going to Harvard, but at far fewer numbers. So anyway, Bell Hooks' point was affirmative action is meant to intervene in exactly that point. However, what it fails to grapple with is the fact that actually, like, the inequalities enter before that point. It enters before the application to college. It is not actually enough to weigh these things. It's just not enough. Is basically what she was saying. Yeah. Now race enters into here too, right? Again, we're talking about schools. Public schools are funded by property taxes. Historically, in the United States, there was a practice called redlining, which was basically a system where people would draw lines on maps of cities that would say, okay, black people can live here but not here. So what that did was it created it was housing discrimination, right? It was a form of segregation. And even after Jim Crow ends, this practice continues on an informal level. For example, it happens through realtor companies and things like that, right? So it's happening in practice, if even not in law. And one of the effects is that black neighborhoods tend to be lower, like housing value tends to be less, right? So it created a systematic, and even if you were individually or as a family a middle class black family, you would still, through redlining, be living in a lower income neighborhood overall. You would not be allowed to move into those higher income neighborhoods. And even to this day, race is correlated with property value. Property values are higher in majority white neighborhoods. And as people of color move in, the property value goes down. This is a systematic phenomenon. It's what happens when these implicit racial hierarchies, this implicit worldview, has an effect in terms of larger market forces over what forms of housing are seen as desirable. So whether or not you as an individual think that living in a multiracial neighborhood is a positive or negative thing, it has a market effect, which means, by extension, multiracial households have lower property values. Multiracial neighborhoods have lower property values than segregated white neighborhoods. Purely, not on even on the basis of the value of the home in any other way other than that demographic composition of the neighborhood. Which means schools that serve neighborhoods that are more segregated are going to have more resources. So these social hierarchies play out over the course of people's lives, and they create violence. They create differences in life chances and opportunities, differences in ability to create income. And it does so without any single individual person ever having to do anything immoral, because it's a social system, not an individual one. So what do I mean by this idea that race is a social construct? I have two quotes from different articles that I did not assign to y'all that I think are really helpful for getting at this and opening up the kinds of underlying questions. The first is a quote from Carolyn Williams, who has this article in the New York Times, "You want a Confederate monument? My body is a Confederate monument." So trigger warning here for rape and plantation slavery. What she's basically arguing, she's writing in the aftermath of the riots in Charlottesville, where white supremacists and white nationalists were rioting to keep Confederate statues in place. Ended up killing a person in that riot. And her argument, right, is that her body itself is a monument to the Confederate system and to the plantation system. And she writes, "It is an extraordinary truth of my life that I am biologically more than half white, and yet have no white people in my genealogy in living memory." So she poses this problem, right? How can you be black? She is, everyone looks at her, she is a black woman. If you look at her, you would see, oh, that's a black woman. And yet, more than half of the people in her family tree are white. How do you have that situation? And ultimately, this goes back to the history of plantation slavery and a dynamic in which women, you have a system in which human beings are being dehumanized, they're being treated as objects, literally as property, and lacking any autonomy. And so the result has been, again, think about how symbolic and social systems shape the conditions in which interpersonal violence can happen. You have the patterned rape of enslaved black women, which leads to a number of children who are the children of the white plantation owner and the enslaved black woman, who are then these children are classified as black and kept in slavery. They are enslaved by their own family. And so as a result, right, every person, like in living memory in her family, in Carolyn Williams' family, her mother, her grandmother, her great-grandmother, all of these are black people. And yet, the majority of her family tree is white. How does that happen? Well, here we're going to get at those kinds of things that Kim Tallbear is talking about in terms of hypodescent. What in Jim Crow becomes coded as the one-drop rule. This kind of idea that if you have a single black person in your family tree, you are black. And what if you have a single drop of black blood is the symbolic idea, that's a metaphor. Think back to the metaphors we live by article. A drop of black blood is a metaphor that we live by that makes you black, right? And that creates the system in plantation era slavery in which you increase the number of enslaved people. It's a mechanism that literally increases the wealth of plantation owners by producing enslaved offspring. The second quote I have is from Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. He says, Americans believe the reality of race as a defined, indubitable feature of the natural world. Meaning, in the United States, we have a belief system, we have a cultural ideology that race is biological. It is a biological difference between people with different skin tone. And in racism, the need to ascribe bone-deep features to people and then humiliate, reduce, and destroy them inevitably follows from this inalterable condition. Meaning, in the United States, there is this ideology that if race is a biological reality, racism is just a natural human impulse to create systems, to dislike people in the other group, to create systems that oppress people in the other group. In short, it's framed as human nature. This is just human nature. It's seeing these biological differences and creating social systems to oppress that group, right? And for this reason, like you often see white supremacists going back into the 1920s in the eugenics movement, but also you hear the same thing from contemporary neo-fascist movements today, right? Which say racism is it's just human nature, and if white people don't maintain that position of superiority, of social authority, then they will be overthrown and subordinated to the exact same forms of oppression by people of color. Because if you think that it's human nature, this is just natural and normal behavior, then you think that if you're not the one on top, you're going to be put on the bottom. So this is the ideology. Race is biological, and then as an extension, social inequalities result from those biological differences. In this way, racism is rendered as the innocent daughter of Mother Nature, and one is left to deplore the Middle Passage and Trail of Tears the way one deplores an earthquake, a tornado, or any other phenomenon that can be cast as beyond the handiwork of men. Meaning, if racism is just human nature, if it's just something that exists in every time period and every society, then it essentially becomes a natural disaster. It's the same thing as an earthquake or a tornado. It's something we look at and say, that's bad, that's deplorable. But it is, unfortunately, just human nature. It's a natural disaster. Now, the problem with this, as I will unpack, is that it naturalizes racist violence. It treats racism as as an aspect of human nature that we find in every society across all time, rather than a culturally particular worldview in which certain features, such as skin tone, are inscribed with cultural meaning in arbitrary ways. I'll go deeper into that in the upcoming slides. Now, I had y'all read the AAA Statement on Race. Not the people who come help you out when you get a flat tire, but the American Anthropological Association. So this statement on race represents a consensus within anthropology. It's not really cutting-edge research. It's not people making an argument that would be considered controversial within the field, or not, maybe controversial is not even the right word, but it's not like we're having a debate about these things. It's like, no, this is like the basis. This is the foundation. This is where you start. A consensus in a field is usually not super interesting to practitioners, because if everyone agrees, there's not a lot of space to learn. But I'm emphasizing it here because what I'm talking about is a foundation, and it is counterintuitive based to people raised in that U.S. ideology that I just described through Coates' work. But it's going to help us understand, this is really not something that anthropologists debate about at this point in time. This is well-established consensus knowledge. So, according to that statement on race, in the United States, both scholars and the general public have been conditioned to viewing human races as natural and separate divisions within the human species based on visible differences. We are socially conditioned to view race as if it were biological, as if there were biological differences between white people, black people, Asian American, Latinx, etc., right? However, with the vast expansion of scientific knowledge in this century, it has become clear that human populations are not unambiguously clearly demarcated, biologically distinct groups. Evidence from the genetics, e.g., meaning the DNA, indicate that most physical variation, about 94%, lies within so-called racial groups. Conventional geographic racial groupings differ from one another only in about 6% of their genes. This means that there is greater variation within racial groups than between them. This means there is greater variation within racial groups than between them. If you look at the physical anthropology, if you look at the genetics, there is more variation within the group of white people, or within the group of black people, or within the group of Native American peoples, right, than there are between white and black people, or white and Native American, etc. people, right? The vast majority of genetic variation simply does not correspond to race. One way you could think about this is like latitude. People whose ancestors come from more northern or more southern latitudes where it's colder tend to have an easier time putting on weight and carrying weight. Whereas people from more equatorial geographies tend to be thinner. They tend to have higher metabolisms. They tend to have a harder time putting on that weight, and they tend to be skinnier. And that is adaptive because that extra weight helps keep you warm if it's colder, and not having it helps keep you cool when you are in a warmer environment. So that difference, right, that is a genetic difference among humans, but it doesn't boil down to race. It boils down, whatever the racial group is, it boils down to, like, how cold was the environment you were raised in. So that's just one example of these kinds of variations that exist within racial groups. So only 6% of genetic variation corresponds to race, meaning that race is fundamentally a biologically meaningless category. Race does not differentiate between human beings on the basis of biology in any kind of meaningful fashion. We are looking at a biologically meaningless phenomenon. We're talking about an extremely small part of human biological variation. However, that biologically meaningless, that small 6% skin tone, certain aspects of how your hair grows, for example, those things are given a disproportionate cultural weight. They're loaded symbolically within particular cultural systems. So we're taking a biologically meaningless set of differences and giving them a disproportionate, a massive social and symbolic and cultural weight. So Coates helps us understand this again. Difference in hue and hair is old, meaning, yes, for a long time in human existence, people have had different skin tones and they've had different hair textures. That is absolutely true. However, but the belief in the preeminence of hue and hair, the notion that these factors can correctly organize a society, the idea that these differences matter, that they signify deeper attributes, things like intelligence, athletic ability, whatever the fuck, civilizational capacity. The fact that these are indelible, meaning that they are immutable, that they're natural. This is a new idea. That is a new idea at the heart of a new people, a group of new people who are coming to start to identify themselves, are constructing a group identity where none existed before, who are brought up hopelessly, tragically, deceitfully to believe that they are white. Meaning, we're taking Yes, so differences in hue and hair, skin tone, hair texture. Those are those are differences that have existed in human history for a long time. But the idea that these differences matter and the idea that we can correctly organize a society on the basis of those factors, that's a new idea. And through this new idea, which takes shape in the 18th and 19th century specifically, people start to construct new group identities, including this idea that like people start coming to see themselves as white, as European, as Western. However, this idea of white people, for example, that's a modern invention. That's only a couple hundred years old. What this means is race is the child of racism, not the father. Meaning, it's not that. Okay, let me start over. If you look at his prior quote, right, there's this ideology in the United States that race is biological, and then racism is a natural effect of those differences, is that people naturally don't like people in their group. However, race is not biologically meaningful. And as such, we see that the idea of race, the social construct that there's a such thing as white people, or there's a such thing that these ideas, that these categories matter, that you can organize a society based on them. That cultural set of symbols, the idea that race exists, let alone the cultural assumption that race exists as a biological reality, the ideology that race is a biological reality. That is a social system, meaning that's racism. So it's actually our social structures, the system of social inequalities that lead to the belief that these differences matter, that these differences are biological, that these differences are mechanisms that we could organize society around. Race is a function of racism, not the other way around. So when people talk to you about, say things like racism is just, it's human nature, it's something that's happened since time immemorial, no, it has not. That is not true. Race is a modern invention. Racism is a modern invention. And if you want to talk about how violence is organized in societies prior to the 1800s, we can do that. But it's not going to be organized on the basis of race. Now, when I say that race is a social construct, I'm going to make two moves. And you're going to see me make these two moves again and again and again. Whenever I say something is a social construct, I'm going to do both of these moves. I'm going to say it's going to vary cross-culturally, and I will show you how. And then I will give you the history for where these ideas come from, how they were constructed over time. Because when I say, think back to that early kind of talk we did about Franz Boas, and this argument that culture is not reducible to biology, that we have to understand culture on its own terms. When I say something is culturally constructed, if it varies cross-culturally, then it is not biological. Because if something were biological, it would be something that shapes all human life. And it wouldn't vary from society to society. 2, if it varies historically, if there's a history, if it's something that was created at a certain point of time, it's not biology. Because if it was biology, it would have existed throughout all of human history. Or at least the history of modern, biologically modern Homo sapiens sapiens. So if we see these variations over time and over space, we know it's not biology, it's culture. So Brazil is a great example because in Brazil is a highly racialized society. Brazil is a society that is deeply, deeply, deeply shaped by the history of plantation slavery and white supremacy. However, the system that emerged, the way of understanding race, is radically different than what happens in the United States. Whereas in the United States, you have this legacy of hypodescent, as Kim Tallbear says, this idea of the one-drop rule, the idea that you are either one group or another. You are either white or you are black, or you're Native American, or you're Asian American, right? It's one or the other. That's not how it works in Brazil. In Brazil, race is seen as a system of gradients, between whiteness on one end of the spectrum and blackness and indigeneity on the other. And in fact, there's a vast set of terminology that comes into existence to name all the different points within that spectrum, which are seen as a hierarchy, right? It's still a hierarchical system, just with many, many different kind of mid-grades. You see the same thing in parts of the South where French and Spanish colonialism was historically more prominent. Like in New Orleans, historically, there is a whole phenomenon of what were called at the time maroons, or mulatto people. Mulatto people were people who were half white and half black. Right, like that's a category, that's a gradient category, right? Whereas in Jim Crow, that older system that comes out of French colonialism is replaced by a more, at least on a legally replaced, by a system that views you are either white or black, and that is what determines your access to things like water fountains, pools, etc., etc. So in Brazil, this man, Fish, is talking to his daughter, right? Who says his daughter is mixed race. Fish is a white man, his wife is black. So he asks his daughter, "Are you black?" And she says, "Yes." Because in the United States, if you have a white mother and a white father and a black mother, you are socially classified as black. Now, increasingly today, we have a new category of mixed race, but that's also interesting because white people aren't really good at identifying it. So, like, my nephews are mixed race, and it's funny because white people tend to think they're black, but black people think they're mixed race. But that's a side note. Our perceptions, basically what I'm saying is, our perceptions are actually quite different on pattern and systematic social ways. So then he asks his daughter's his daughter's boyfriend, right? Because straight people exist. Sorry, I forgot. He asks his daughter's boyfriend the same question: "Are you black?" And he says no, because the boyfriend is from Brazil. And how can that be? Fish asks. He's darker than she is. So here's this really interesting situation. The daughter says she's black. The boyfriend says he's not black, even though he is phenotypically, he looks darker skinned than she is. The difference is that in Brazil, he would have a different category that he would use. He would not use what we would translate as black. He would use a different social classification. So even though he's darker skinned than the daughter, in Brazil, he would not be classified as black. And in Brazil, the daughter, too, would not be classified as black, right? But in the United States, both of them get classified as black. So, for example, someone might be categorized as branca. So branca translates as white, although Brazilians who come to the United States, especially those from elite families, are often dismayed to find that they are not considered white here. Even worse, they are viewed as Hispanic, despite the fact that they speak Portuguese. So you come from like an upper middle class, if in Brazil you're coming from an upper middle class family, and you are considered white within that social system, branca. However, in the United States, people look at you and they don't see you as white anymore. They see you as Hispanic, which is really interesting because Hispanic means that Spanish speaking, and you actually speak Portuguese. But you are classified in the social system as Hispanic, which means your racial categories have literally changed from one social context to the other. So if Americans believe that race is an immutable biological given, the reality is that many people can change their race by getting on a plane. If race were truly a biological phenomenon, your racial categorization would not change based on getting on a plane and going from Brazil to the United States, or vice versa. You know, we also see this with Kim Tallbear, right? Race is actually constructed in multiple contradictory ways in the United States alone. Kim Tallbear talks about this, right, with hypodescent versus hyperdescent, meaning if you have, there's the one drop rule for black people, right? If you have one drop of black blood, again, that's a metaphor. That's not, literally, blood does not work that way. You are classified as black. Whereas for indigeneity, there's a different rule called blood quantum, which is the idea that you have a fraction. You might be, we say like you could be like full-blooded Native American or half or a quarter Native American, half or a quarter Cherokee, for example, or Apache or something like that, right? Again, this is a metaphor. Indigenous peoples often make the joke like, "Oh yeah, I'm half Apache. It's my leg and my left arm." Like it's that half. Like it's a joke, right? But it points out like this is a metaphor. This is a metaphor that we live by. However, so with indigenous identity, race is constructed through this idea of the opposite of the one-drop rule, which is that your blood can be almost diluted into whiteness. So, for example, in Australia, there was programs in which indigenous Australians were systematically bred in order to reduce that quantum to create a more and more white population. And the idea was that by breeding out, I hope this hurts to hear because this is super violent, by breeding out the indigeneity or the blackness, because indigenous peoples in Australia are black-skinned, even though the analogy is going to be a lot closer to indigenous peoples here in the United States. The skin tone is black. So tried to breed out the blackness in order to assimilate them, the indigenous peoples, into what was considered white civilization. Likewise, in the United States, you have these kinds of same rules that have the function of reducing the number of indigenous peoples, or people who are, legally considered indigenous. Because if you're legally considered indigenous, that's what determines how the government is going to distribute, for example, rights, like treaty rights. Will treaty rights apply to you? Will land rights apply to you? There's really well-documented examples from Hawaii where new rules determined that you were only eligible, I want to say this is in the 50s, but I might have the date wrong. New legal codes determined that you would only be eligible for land claims if you were 50% or more Native Hawaiian, which meant that a lot of people were no longer eligible to make land claims. So Kim Tallbear kind of points out the social impact of this system is that you're able to produce more enslaved bodies, a larger black population within this plantation slavery system, and less native bodies, which pose a challenge to settler systems, because if you're trying to build a new society on an indigenous people's land base, having less indigenous peoples means less land claims. We see this, so there are fundamentally two distinct cultural logics happening in terms of how race is constructed in the United States, and these contradictory social logics happen simultaneously. Another great example actually comes from Virginia. In the 1920s, in Virginia, the Virginia government, state government passed the I'm forgetting what it's called. It's like the Racial Integrity Act. That's it. The Racial Integrity Act. What this did was this defined the legal criteria for how race would be determined, how people's racial status would be determined within the context of a Jim Crow system. So, this new law, the Racial Integrity Act, encoded the idea of the one-drop rule, meaning if you had any black ancestry, you were legally coded as colored within this racial system. Now, don't use that word colored outside of the context of we're talking about Jim Crow and the particular construction of race at that moment that was legally encoded. However, for Native Americans, they created an exception, and there was an amendment that changed this a few years down the line. It's referred to as the Pocahontas exception, because the thing is, a number of wealthy Virginians actually claimed at this point in time to be descended from Pocahontas, because Pocahontas was seen as royalty. Again, this is the 1920s. Pocahontas is seen as, she's seen as the daughter of a chief, right? She is an aristocrat. She is Or, like we say, like, there's like a stereotype of like Cherokee princesses, right? There's this kind of language. This is not a social structure within Cherokee systems of social organization at the time. There just aren't princesses, there aren't kings, there aren't queens. It's a different system of social organization than that. And the confusing point is that most, like Cherokee and many, actually, indigenous peoples didn't have the same hierarchies between men and women that Europeans did. So a lot of women were seen as princesses, but actually what was happening was a lack of discrimination. Anywho, right? There's this idea of being descended from Pocahontas. It's like you have a claim to royalty. It's in a way of claiming an aristocratic pedigree, analogous to aristocrats in Europe. So by the 1900s, there's a long history of wealthy Virginians claiming ancestry from Pocahontas to kind of leverage this kind of like aristocratic claim to the land that would make them the peers, ideologically speaking, to aristocrats in the United States. In Europe. It's a class move. And so, several years down the road, the Pocahontas section, I think it was changed, they changed the blood quantum. You were at one point, and I forget which is the order. When the law was first passed, it was 1, and then they changed it to the other. But it changed from 1/8 to 1/16. And the idea was that if you had less than that fraction of Native American blood, you would be legally considered white. Which meant this Pocahontas exception let wealthy white people continue to claim ancestry from Pocahontas without relinquishing their status, their legal status as white people. Now I'm going to do the historical piece. Where does this idea of race and racism come from? So trigger warning here. I'm going to talk about scientific racism, which is a field of scholarship that emerged historically in the 18 and 1900s that sought to explain social differences through this new set of ideas that we have come to know as race. I'm going to show you diagrams from that scholarship that portray BIPOC people as animalistic. These are dehumanizing representations. Think back to Page West, right? What is the system of representations, and how do those representations have tangible impacts on people's lives? So this is a set of representations that are going to be dehumanizing, animalistic. Now, these ideas of scientific racism are a precursor to eugenics, which emerges in the 1900s and ends up really taking off both in the United States and in Nazi Germany. American and Nazi scientists are working real closely with each other on this one. There's a lot of crossover historically in these ideas. And a lot of the ideas that Nazi scientists are drawing on that organize these new projects of creating a master race are actually drawn from American scientific fields. So, this is where I'm pulling from Lee Baker's A History of a Racialized Worldview, right? How does this worldview emerge historically where we start seeing people on the basis of race, of this new idea of race? And it comes out of the 18th century, right? This idea of scientific racism, which was a school of thought that seeks to classify human diversity according to rigid hierarchical schemas, right? The assumption was we could explain human difference on the basis of race. Just like social evolutionism, we can explain human differences on the basis of a linear trajectory of development. We can explain human difference on the basis of race, which we presume to be a biological feature. And Lee Baker says, the critical difference between the 17th century English ideas of savagery and the early 20th century ideas in the United States was the authority, where the source of authority comes from. The former was religious, the latter scientific. Now, savagery, that might be a little confusing because it's actually not the same word. The word savagery is the same as what we talked about with social evolutionism, but here it's actually a pre-social evolutionist meaning. In this context, savagery is another way of saying infidel. The distinction in the 17th century in Europe was not between races. It was between Christians and non-Christians. However, a lot of shit starts changing in the 1800s, and in fact, the entire system of authority on which we build the basis of our society shifts away from religion. Religion becomes less of an authoritative system in terms of social organization, and what does emerge is new ideas of biology. Biology becomes our system of authority. Our system of, like, when we want to say if something is true, how do you know it's true? We go with recourse to biology now, not to the Bible. So, and here I want to clarify, I'm not talking about actual empirical biology. I'm talking about how biology was imagined at this particular point in time. And basically what we see in this time period, and you will see this pattern because we'll talk about it in many other contexts, is that systems of social inequalities, the justifying basis shifted from a religious justification to now it was saying human nature, human biology. These are biological differences. So race is a new way of explaining these social inequalities that moves away from this idea of infidels, of non-Christians, as a way of encoding colonized peoples, and instead towards race. So in terms of the driving forces historically, we have colonialism, because that's the system that shapes, and capitalism, differences in wealth. These are the systems that shape these social inequalities that then race enters into the picture to try to explain, as well as this new shift away from religion as a source of authority and towards science, but also plantation slavery and later Jim Crow. So when we talk about scientific racism, right, basically scientists created a system of classification that it was like, how do we name all the different racial types? Can we create a universal system that defines all the racial types? And those racial types were believed to be linked to things like intelligence, athletic capacity or physical capacity for civilization, emotional, what's the word I'm looking for? Like tendencies. Also, even just the capacity to feel pain. There was a belief in the plantation world that black people felt less pain. That was there was this belief that they could work through the heat in ways white people couldn't because of that. And you could subject black people to forms of physical corporal punishment that you couldn't subject to white people because they were believed to physically feel less pain. This is that beginning of that ideology that we still see in medical practice today, where there actually is a continued implicit belief, or gut sense almost, that white people's pain is taken more seriously. This is the origin of that system. So, right, there's this way of, so we're seeing a new system. It's an ideological system that seeks to explain social inequalities between colonized and enslaved people and colonizers and enslaving people. It's a way of it's an ideology that seeks to make those social inequalities appear natural, because if it's believed to be a function of biology, then it is natural. Now, one scientific field that comes up to do this is this practice called phrenology. Phrenology emerges in the 19th century, and it's essentially about measuring skull size and shape. And the idea is that by measuring skull size and shape, you can create a scientific basis for understanding, for creating different racial categories. And people did these studies, and so for example, one of the things people would look at was commonly cranial cavity, right? Skull cavity size, volume. How big is the cavity in your skull that holds your brain? Because the belief was if you have a bigger skull cavity, you have a bigger brain. And if you have a bigger brain, you're smarter. Now, from a contemporary biological perspective, none of those three things hold. Having a bigger cranial cavity doesn't necessarily mean you have a bigger brain. Having a bigger brain doesn't necessarily mean that you're smarter. Those things just don't follow from the other. However, that was the belief system in the 1900s. And so different scientists came up with all of these different methods. And actually, they're not very scientific methods. Like, there's all these different, I'll come back to this in a second, but like, there's a lot of variation in terms of how people decide they're going to measure volume. There's not really a standard system. But what they find, sort of, what they argue, what they say their data shows them, is that white people have larger skulls or larger cranial cavities, thus are smarter, thus deserve a place at the top of the social hierarchy. That's just natural. And here in this diagram to the side, you see a image that's taken from a phrenological text. And what it does is it tries to compare what it considers a white person's skull against a black person's skull against a ape's skull, right? So you see that hierarchy, that animalization, that dehumanization of treating people of color, and in this case black people specifically, as lower on a scale of humanity, as subhuman, literally. And it's justified through these ideas that there are these different skull shapes, smaller cranial cavities, and a more sloping brow that is more similar to a non-human primate. And over to this side even further, you see several more different racial types, many of which are caricatures, including indigenous peoples from South America, etc., right? Now, the thing is, with all of these measurements, they were fudging the data like hell. And in fact, this is one of Franz Boas's early interventions at the beginning of the moment of anthropology, is to reanalyze this data and be like, yeah, they just fucked up the data. Like if you look at this stuff systematically, if you systematically measure this stuff, you just do not find these differences. That is just totally not what happens. But people were trying to fit the data into their pre-existing assumptions that race existed and was a biological phenomenon that could justify these inequalities. Now we can also ask, how did these scientists get so many skulls? Like, you need thousands and thousands of skulls to study to do this. There's all kinds of answers. One way would be scouring battlefields to decapitate the heads of people killed, and sell them to universities and museums. Another would be grave robbing. That was a common one. And you could also disappear people, particularly like in poor communities. But one of the kinds of effects of this new scientific field is there actually emerges a global market for the buying and selling of skulls. And white people's skulls actually end up costing more in this system because, first of all, they're harder to get because white people are better protected within these legal systems. But you can even see these racial hierarchies emerging in the level of the cost, the money that a different skull would bring you on the market. So there's entire industries of people collecting skulls to sell to scientists. And even Franz Boas does this. Franz Boas grave robs indigenous cemeteries. He's not like... He's important because he defines many of these core ideas of anthropology, like this idea that race is not a biological phenomenon, and you can't explain culture on the basis of race or on the basis of biology. And he gives us that social evolutionism implies ethnocentric standards instead of actually providing us useful scientific information. But he's not a perfect person, right? He's also grave robbing in order to make these anti-racist arguments, which is an interesting contradiction. Where do these skulls go? A lot of them sit in museums. Museums still have them. And now, today, museums are stuck with these collections of large volumes of skulls. There's even some in the classrooms. If you look at the anthropology lab, those are not actual human skulls. I'm almost positive those are, what do you call them? I mean, they're not human skulls anyway. They're actually non-human. They're what do you say? They're not Homo sapiens, but they're different branches on the human evolutionary tree. But they're also not actual real skulls. They're reproductions. But one thing that becomes really contentious, right, is that indigenous peoples in the United States, for example, start protesting the keeping of human remains in museums, both from archaeology and from this earlier practice of phrenology, and start demanding that human remains are returned so they can be reburied and put in a proper, respectful way, and treated in a respectful way. This ultimately, there are social movements in the 60s and 70s and 80s leading into this, and by 1990, the U.S. Congress steps in and passes what's called the Native American Graves Repatriation and Protection Act. What this does is it requires that universities inventory all their human remains and determine who those human remains, for Native American human remains, what indigenous nation those human remains are associated with, and then return those. If that community wants them, return them to that community, and that community can do what they want with them, which is sometimes, it's almost always to rebury them, essentially. This is considered a huge political and emotional and spiritual issue among indigenous peoples because it is considered a spiritual violation to not be buried in a proper way, or to be unburied. And the other thing that NAGPRA does now is archaeologists, if you're an archaeologist today and you encounter Native American human remains, you have to stop right there and you need to figure out who is the tribe that has jurisdiction and work with them and consult with them to figure out what is the best situation to do. Do you leave them in the ground because that's the most respectful thing? Do you excavate them and do some limited studies before reburying them? Because maybe the tribe thinks that information could be useful. Or do you rebury them somewhere else because maybe the cemetery where they were buried is now at risk? For example, you see this in coastal locations where cemeteries are at risk of going underwater. So sometimes people might excavate a cemetery and then move it to a different location that is less at risk. But ultimately, that is up to the nation whose jurisdiction you are in to decide what is an appropriate way of handling these remains. Now, one thing that we find in this system is that the racial categories that phrenologists and scientific racist scientists were articulating actually do not map onto our categories of race today. This is a good moment for seeing that this is socially constructed. Y'all would not understand most of the categories that people are using at this time period. So I'm going to use the scientific it's the science of the time. I'm going to use the terms that these scientists were using. These are going to be super fucking racist terms. So I just want to preface that I'm about to say some racist terms. In the diagram I have to the right at the top, you see multiple different racial categories that were identified by this particular text, right? This is how this text at this point in time broke up the human species into what it believed were racial subcategories. And below each of those images, you see a skull shape that is understood to be typical of that racial group. And then you see the fauna, the animals that correspond to that environmental geographical location. So there's this kind of, again, you're seeing this kind of logic that is treating human beings, that's treating race as a kind of biological function that is analogous to different species of animals. So in this particular diagram, you can zoom into the PowerPoint and you should be able to see it. And actually I need to zoom in because it's so low and I want to make sure I get it right because I don't want to be saying the wrong racist terms. So the first category is Negro. That word is constructed as a racial type with a specific skull shape in it from a geography with certain animals like chimps and elephants and rhinos and giraffes, right? Now, the second racial type defined is Hottentot. Hottentot is another really offensive term. It's what this scholar is distinguishing between Negro and Hottentot racial types. Both correspond to what today we would call black. Again, remember, this is a different racial typology. So the category of Hottentot, it actually corresponds to a particular ethnic group in Africa. And it's, I'm blanking, I want to say South Africa, but I might be wrong about that. But the idea, right, is this is a distinct racial group. So this category that we use today of black is actually not the category that was being used at this time. The next category is Malay, right? So this is, I guess you would say like Southeast Asian is the racial category that we would most closely consider this today. And then Australian, right? Which is indigenous peoples to Australia. You see terms, for example, like Mongoloid during this period, right? The ideas that people are coming, the racial categories that people constructed in this time period were distinct from the racial categories we use today. That system has changed over time because it is not a biological system, it is a social system. And social systems change over time. Whoops, I forgot to say this. The bottom picture, right? The bottom picture on this slide, what we see in that example is another one of these hierarchies in which scientists, phrenologists are seeking to correlate skull size and shape to different racial categories. And we see the animalization, or the construction of a hierarchy between like fully human, which is associated with whiteness, and primate. Humans are primates by definition. We are actually greater apes. All humans are greater apes. So it's confusing, right? But more animalistic, non-human primates. More ape-like, because humans are apes. But, I think y'all understand what I'm saying, trying to articulate, right? And we see, again, the sloping forehead and the different skull capacity, right? The skull cavity capacity, cranial cavity. So again, this is not scientifically accurate, right? Since the early 1900s, these ideas have been thoroughly refuted by people like Franz Boas. This is bad science. They fudged the numbers. However, you see the construction of an ideology in which racial types are conflated within a hierarchy of more and less human. And people of color are represented as more animalistic. Now, one effect that comes out of this is social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is basically an idea, I think I may have talked about this with some of y'all's classes, Social Darwinism is a ideology that emerges in the 18 and 1900s alongside of this. So Darwin says, oh shit, like species evolve, right? And suddenly there's this radical shift in belief systems, right? In which, again, think of that shift from treating religion as an authority to biology as an authority. There's a shift, right, where suddenly it becomes clear that Earth is a lot older than people had believed based on the Bible previous to that, and that different species were not created as they were, but they evolved over time. So some people took that idea of evolution and tried to apply it to human societies. So we saw that with social evolutionism, and social Darwinism is making a very similar argument. Social Darwinism specifically, though, is arguing that that basically we can think about humans as having some humans are more fit and some are less fit, and if we let the less fit humans die, then humanity as a species will improve, right? This is a precursor to eugenics. This is a precursor to Nazi ideas of the master race, right? The idea is that poor people, people of color, are genetically inferior. and should be allowed to die from social systems. So think, for example, the differences in medical outcomes that we talked about, how medical outcomes vary by race and class. This is an argument saying that's a good thing because it means less fit people will die and humans will evolve into a stronger master race. So again, this is super fucking racist, right? And one of the main figures in this movement, in this intellectual movement, was Herbert Spencer. And many of you have probably heard this idea of survival of the fittest. And you were probably taught about survival of the fittest in biology classes in high school. That term does not come from evolutionary biology. That comes from social Darwinism. That comes from Herbert Spencer. That phrase we have, survival of the fittest, comes out of scholarship that was arguing for letting people die in order to improve the genetic capacity of the human species. It was later imported from Herbert Spencer into evolutionary biology, and we still use that framing today, to the point that we've actually forgotten that framing itself is rooted in these actually scientific racism kinds of worldviews, frameworks. So Herbert Spencer and social Darwinism, right, we're applying the principles of evolutionary biology to the study of society in order to try to explain racial inferiority as scientific law. And this leads to all kinds of different ideologies, including ideological justifications for eliminating safety nets, because safety nets are now seen as negative if you're keeping the human species from evolving. Maybe it's better just to let poor people die. That's the ideology of social Darwinism, right? That's the ideology at the time. You also have ideas like white man's burden, which I hope y'all learned a little bit about in high school. It's this ideology of the time that basically is that white people have a burden to lift up non-white people and carry them to civilization. So in this cartoon to the bottom, it's an older cartoon. You can see the caricatures, the racist caricatures in these images, right? And it represents the United States and England carrying up colonized peoples up this mountain, and like the rocks are like labeled things like religion, superstition, ignorance, etc., up to the top of the mountain where civilization sits. So it's framed, this is a very patronizing ideology. It's the idea that it's white people's responsibility or burden to pull up everyone else, whether, according to a social evolutionist framework, into white civilization or, it's this kind of social evolutionist thinking. It enters into scientific racism as well, because certain groups are seen as being capable of reaching civilization, while others are not. One common idea of the time, and you see this again with Kim Tallbear's ideas of hypo versus hyper descent, is brain fart. You see this with Kim Tallbear's idea of hyper versus hypo descent. Indigenous peoples were actually imagined as being able to be brought into white civilization, which is why you end up with things like boarding schools. Black people were seen as not able to enter into civilization, which led to different racial regimes like Jim Crow. So, yeah, I just think this is super important and useful to know. This idea of survival of the fittest, we learn it in evolutionary biology, but it actually comes out of this history of race as a worldview. Now, race really, the social construction of race transforms radically at the moment of Jim Crow. So you have to understand historically what's happening is previously, racial hierarchies were entrenched through a system of plantation slavery, right? What does it mean to be black and white? How does that system of inequality reproduce itself? It reproduces itself through this set of institutions of the plantation. However, following emancipation, slavery is abolished, at least in law. I mean, you do see a lot of things like sharecropping and other various mechanisms used to create a what's called de facto or in effect situation of slavery, even if it was an illegal situation of slavery. And following emancipation, you have Reconstruction, which is this massive social project to basically reconstruct U.S. society, to eliminate racial hierarchies, or if not eliminate, I should restate this, to eliminate the legal reproduction of racial hierarchies. It's not necessarily that white people believed in equality at this point. Like, for example, Abraham Lincoln did not believe in that white people and black people were equal. But rather it is a abolition of the legal structures of subordination. It's saying those are not just, right? And so the attempt is to restructure, to reconstruct particularly Southern society in order to promote legal equity between races. And for example, in this time period, you see the first black senators who become very prominent for a time. However, as time goes on, you see political power shift, and those people who had been advancing Reconstruction at that time, which at the time was the Republican Party. There's a point in time where the Republican Party and the Democratic Party basically switch, but the Republican Party is advancing Reconstruction, and the Democratic Party ends up, after several decades, seizing control over the power shifts, and they're able to seize control over the federal government, and they actually dismantle Reconstruction. And part of what happens is the creation of new legal systems like Jim Crow. So what Jim Crow does is it reestablishes and reentrenches a legal system of authority or of difference for race, right? So race becomes a legal category once again with different rights distributed based on racial status. So this is a legal system of gentrification. And that system, not gentrification, of segregation. And that system was articulated in new ways, right? It's articulated as white versus colored, which is different than those categories we saw in those phrenological texts, right? The social categories are shifting in this moment. The worldview is shifting. And race continues to shift. For example, you have the civil rights movement, and eventually the dismantling of Jim Crow as a legal system. Now, one of the complexities that happens is even though Jim Crow's legal system was dismantled, you still had, in effect, a lot of, in practice, extra-legal, paralegal practices that maintained racial inequalities. So you can integrate public schools, but then you have what's called white flight, where a lot of white families move to the suburbs into majority white neighborhoods where they can continue to send their kids to white schools. And in fact, to this day, schools remain, in effect, largely segregated, right? Like, I'm sure y'all have experienced this if you were raised, particularly in the South, where we have enough people to actually do segregation. But I'm sure, you went to a school that was probably majority white or majority black if you're from the South, right? So there is still, this is called a de facto form of segregation rather than a de jure form of segregation. De facto means in effect or in fact, and de jure means by law. So it's not a legal form of segregation, it's a in practice, by effect form of segregation. Likewise, I mentioned the practice of redlining in a previous example. And so you end up with this kind of new sets of racial formations, new ways of understanding what it is to be a raced human being. We have this idea of mixed race that's increasingly coming into prominence. That's a new social category in the United States. We have new ideas. There's new people talking about racism without Native American DNA, the older idea of blood quantum, of being full or a half or a quarter or however much Native American, is now being replaced by this idea of DNA, including people can take DNA tests that are supposed to tell you whether, like, what percentage of Native American DNA you have. Now, there's a lot of issues there. We don't have a lot of time to go into that, but it's a fascinating set of studies. Kim Tallbear is the person to go into if you want to talk about that. She does a really interesting job doing things like, first of all, deconstructing the ways in which geneticists who aren't trained in social scientists believe in things like the idea of a racial type. So there's like a kind of pure Native American racial type that they imagine as a genetic construct. This isn't that different than scientific racism. It's just a new set of criteria, right? Instead of blood, we're doing DNA. And so there's this kind of belief that you can isolate that pure racial type, right? But like that itself, right, is part of this racialized thinking. The idea that there are pure racial types in the first place, waiting to be discovered in the world, as opposed to socially constructed by our social systems. And that creates all kinds of interesting conflicts, for example, within indigenous communities and people who start claiming to be Native American because they have a DNA test, even if they do not maintain living relationships within a Native community. In indigenous studies, like the thing about Native American identity is it's not actually just about race. It's as much about being a citizen of a sovereign nation that was colonized by the United States and maintaining a legal-to-legal basis of interaction with the United States. A nation-to-nation basis of interaction with the United States, for example, through treaties. So, if you're a citizen, you can be a citizen of a Native American nation. That doesn't say anything about your racial identity. In fact, Native American nations are historically and to this day very racially diverse. However, again, DNA, it's a new way people are starting to construct race with new ideas, new problems, new complexities. Biologists, geneticists don't necessarily understand race as a social construct. They don't necessarily understand the social science aspect of it, whereas people taking these tests or applying these tests don't necessarily understand the nuances of the genetics. Where, for example, if you get a test that says you are X% Native American DNA, that doesn't actually mean you are X% Native American. That means you are X% likely to have a Native American ancestor. But those nuances get lost in translation, right, between popular discourse and scientific practice. So if you want to learn more about that, it's fascinating. Kim Tallbear is the scholar who does that work. You also see phenomenon such as the bell curve, which I'm going to talk about because going back to Fish and his argument about race in the United States versus Brazil, he kind of concludes his book with a critique of this idea called the bell curve. So the bell curve was a set of studies, I want to say in the 1990s, maybe early aughts, I'm kind of blanking. But basically what it did is it said, if you look at U.S. students' test scores in high school, you see a bell curve, right? Most students tend to score in the middle. So a few students score very well and get like A's, and a few students score badly and get lower grades, right? And what this study found was that white people were more likely to score higher, and black people and Latinx people were more likely to, and indigenous peoples were more likely to score lower. Asian people, I don't remember what happened exactly at this historical moment, but I think they might have been closer to the white pattern. So anyway, there's this kind of set of statistical information that test scores are breaking down by race. And so the authors of this study made the argument that this was a function of biology, that white students were smarter and thus able to score higher than many students of color. Now the problem here is that race is simply not a biological category. We cannot explain these kinds of phenomenon based on the assumption that race is a biological category, because that is simply untrue. The premises of that conclusion are themselves flawed. So this is what Fish says When American researchers study racial differences in behavior in search of biological rather than social causes and differences between socially defined groups, they are wasting their time. So if we're studying racial differences in test scores and we are looking for a biological rather than social explanation for those differences, we are wasting our time. Because the most elegant experimental designs and statistical analysis, when applied flawlessly to biologically meaningless categories, can only produce a very expensive waste of time. However elegant your statistical analysis is, if the categories you are measuring are themselves not biologically meaningful, and your argument is that this is a biological phenomenon, you're only, the premises of your argument are themselves invalid, however good your analysis is. So, what we look for is, instead of saying, oh, if there are differences in test scores by race, can we identify those, what are the social rather than biological explanations? Now, going back to that point that I made at the beginning of lecture about school funding being tied to property taxes, property values being tied to race. The effect of that system, the effect of systematically underfunding schools that used to be legally segregated and to this day are often in effect de facto segregated, is that students of color are often less prepared because they're going to they're going to high schools with less funding. That's a social explanation for these differences. That's structural violence, not biology. You can also look at things like, it's been studied and found that if you, it's called stereotype bias is I think the word, like if you bring up people's racial identities, they're more likely to score, white people are more likely to score higher on a test after doing that. Black people are more likely to score lower. I have some anxiety about this upcoming test because I'm going to need to test y'all, including on things about, well, I've been teaching you about race and racism. And I'm concerned about the way that stereotype threat might affect some of y'all's scores. And I haven't quite figured that process out. But I do hope it is clear that when we talk about race and racism in this class, we are talking about understanding, we are talking about a social critique of racism as a social structure and race as a set of social categories that are biologically meaningless. And what matters is to be able to show, to explain, to argue, and demonstrate the flawed nature of these assumptions. Now, again, sticking with this contemporary racial formations, one of the things you see increasingly is this idea of social systems where you can have racism without racists. I love the name of that book just because it's such an evocative title. How do you have a system in which you can have racism, you can have racial hierarchies without people who are individually racists, right? For a long time when I was a kid, for example, the dominant ideology in white communities was this thing called color blindness. You were not supposed to see race. There's a funny joke that someone told me once of, like, they were on a date and they're black and this boy was white. And the boy's like, oh, I don't even see, they've been on many dates, they've been dating for a while, and the boy is like, oh, I don't even see you as black. And she ended up breaking up with him over that because she's like, I am black. That is an important part of my identity. That's something that shapes the way I am able to move through a racist society. So if you can't see that, I don't want to be with you. But this was the idea, was what it meant to be a good white person was that you, quote unquote, don't see race. You are colorblind. And in recent years, we have a social system where it is considered morally bad to be a racist. And we think about racism as a function of individual racists rather than social systems. And yet, racism, these social inequalities, continue to be reproduced. For example, through that example I've been giving of medicine or schooling, right? even without individuals who have explicitly racist beliefs themselves, right? Well-intentioned individuals in systems that reproduce violence. Now, this ideology of colorblindness is not really as prominent as it used to be, because what happened between when I was a kid and now is there were a lot of white supremacist riots across the country, and they kept killing people, and it just kind of became clear to everyone, like, oh no, racism really is actually still a problem, and there actually still are these militant fascists and white supremacists. And that changed the conversation. And so what does it look like now? That's an open question. So I just have I'm going to leave y'all with some thoughts to think about. Next class, we will discuss this set of readings for today that I've been referencing, but also we're going to focus more on the 2 readings for Wednesday. You choose one. One is an archaeology reading, one is a sociolinguistics reading. And again, think about this kind of set of questions. If race is not biological but social, and we need to be able to come up with social explanations because this category is biologically meaningless, how do we understand race and racism as a social system operating in these moments? So one of the articles focuses on hip-hop and language in hip-hop communities. That's going to be a little older, so you might think about how has this changed? How has the sociolinguistic practices around race changed since this article? How has hip-hop changed? But also, we could talk about things like blackfishing and the sociolinguistics of blackfishing. Or in the archaeology article, that's going to look at social movements in New York, where there was a cemetery of enslaved people in New York that was found, and the local black community actually organized in such a way that protests some of the kind of messed up aspects of the prior excavation and research questions, which did treat research questions which had been treating race as a biological phenomenon, and the result was a shift in both the people leading that project and the questions being asked that tended to instead look at the social impacts of racism. So taking a more socially, culturally, and anthropologically appropriate approach in the questions they were asking. So think about race as a social system, whichever one you read, and be prepared to explain that article to your peers, because when you invoke those details, when you invoke those examples, you're going to need to make sure your students who didn't read that article follow.